The biggest mistake I see people make today is thinking that being self-sufficient means buying more things. More tools, more fertilizers, more bags of feed, more containers, and more products from the garden center. I made that mistake myself when I was younger, and I slowly learned that an old homestead worked in almost the opposite way. The goal was not to keep buying something every time a problem appeared. The goal was to look around at what you already had and find another use for it. A garden could give you food, seeds, and material for the next season. Chickens could give you eggs, meat, and manure for the soil. Rain falling on your roof could become water for the garden instead of simply running away. Even a small patch of plants could provide food for people, feed for animals, and material for compost. This way of thinking saved families money because they were not starting from zero every spring. They were building on what they had already produced. Many years ago, an older neighbor showed me something that stayed with me. He kept a small envelope of seeds from his best beans and tomatoes every year, and when I asked why he bothered doing it when seeds were cheap at the store, he just said that the best seed was the seed that already proved it could grow on his land. At the time, I did not understand how important that idea was. Later, I realized that losing your own seed supply means starting over every year and depending on someone else for something your own garden can provide. And seeds are only the beginning. There are old crops that can stay in the ground for years, animals that can provide several useful things at once, water that can be collected for free, and simple methods for turning waste into something valuable. In this video, I want to walk you through these forgotten resources and principles one by one, because once you start connecting them together, the whole way you look at a garden and a homestead begins to change. And one of the first things I would bring back is something that can disappear from a garden faster than almost anything else if you are not paying attention. One of the easiest resources to lose is your own seed supply, because once a gardener stops saving seeds for several years, it becomes normal to buy everything again each spring. I have nothing against buying seeds when you need them, but there is a big difference between buying seeds because you want to try something new and buying them because you have no other choice. I learned this from older gardeners who treated good seeds almost like part of the harvest itself. When a tomato plant produced healthy fruit and continued growing well through the season, they did not simply eat the tomatoes and forget about the plant. They selected a few good fruits, saved the seeds, dried them properly, and kept them for the next year. The same idea worked with beans, peas, peppers, pumpkins, and many other open-pollinated crops. Most people make a simple mistake here. They save seeds from the first plant they see instead of choosing from the strongest plants that actually performed well in their own soil and weather. Over several seasons, careful selection can help you keep varieties that are well suited to your garden. You also do not need a large collection of seeds to begin. A few envelopes, a dry container, and a simple note with the name and year can be enough to start building your own supply. I remember one man who kept seeds from the same family bean for many years, and he knew exactly which plants gave the earliest pods and which ones handled dry weather better. He was not doing complicated science. He was simply paying attention and keeping what worked. That is the part of old farming that I think we have forgotten. The garden was not only a place where food was produced, it was also a place where the next garden was prepared. Once you begin thinking this way, an interesting question appears. What if some of the food in your garden did not need to be planted again every spring at all? There are old perennial crops that can stay in the ground and keep producing with much less yearly work, and some of them are still almost unknown to modern gardeners. One of them can give you a reliable harvest while sitting quietly underground, waiting for the right season. One of the simplest ways to make a garden less dependent on yearly shopping is to grow more perennial food, because some crops can remain in the ground and return again without starting the whole process from seed every spring. I have grown ordinary annual vegetables most of my life, but the older I get, the more I appreciate plants that can take care of part of the work themselves. Sunchokes, also called Jerusalem artichokes, are a good example because once they are established they can produce a useful crop underground, and you can leave some tubers in the soil for the following year. Skirret is another old crop that many people today have never heard of, even though its sweet roots were once valued as food. Salsify is also worth knowing because it produces an edible root and can stay useful in a garden where you want dependable crops rather than constant replanting. I would not say you should replace your tomatoes, beans, or potatoes with these plants, but adding a few perennial or easily returning crops gives you another layer of security. Grapes are another good example because one established vine can provide fruit for many years with regular care, and the fruit can be eaten fresh, dried, or preserved. Pawpaw is less familiar to many gardeners, but where the climate allows it, a mature tree can provide fruit for years and does not need to be planted again every season. What I like about these crops is not that they require no work, because every useful plant needs some attention. The advantage is that the work you do today can continue giving something back in future seasons. I remember being told many years ago that a good homestead should have some crops that you plant once and harvest many times, and that advice made more sense to me as the years passed. Most gardeners focus on what they can harvest this summer, but an older style of gardening also asked what would still be producing 5 or 10 years from now. That small change in thinking can save time, money, and effort. But there's another resource on an old homestead that could multiply its usefulness even more, because animals were rarely kept for only one reason. A chicken was not simply a source of eggs, and a goat was not simply an animal in the field. Each animal could become part of a larger system, and once you understand how those pieces fit together, the amount of waste on a small homestead can drop dramatically. When I was younger, I thought keeping animals meant adding another job to the homestead, but older farmers taught me to look at the whole picture instead. A few chickens can give you eggs, meat if you choose to raise them that way, feathers and manure, while also scratching through areas where you want weeds and insects reduced. Their manure can be composted and later returned to the garden instead of becoming something you have to dispose of. Goats can provide milk, manure, and useful vegetation control because they are willing to eat many plants that other animals ignore, although they need proper fencing and care. Pigs were also used in old farming systems for more than one purpose because they could turn suitable food scraps and other feed into meat, while their manure could eventually become part of a managed compost system. Bees are another example that I think deserves more attention because a healthy hive can provide honey, beeswax, and pollination for many fruit trees and garden crops. The important part is not simply owning animals. The important part is choosing animals that fit the land and then making sure their useful outputs go somewhere instead of being wasted. I once watched an older couple move their chicken area around a garden section after harvest, and they did not see the chickens as a problem that needed to be cleaned up later. They saw the birds as part of the preparation for the next season. The chickens scratched through plant remains, searched for insects, and left manure behind, and after the area had rested, it could be prepared for planting. This does not mean you should put animals directly on every garden bed because too much manure or uncontrolled scratching can cause problems. The old method was based on timing and moderation. The same principle applies to goats, pigs, and bees. Each one can contribute something different when managed carefully. And there is another resource that costs nothing at all but is often allowed to disappear down a drain or run across the yard. I mean rainwater. I remember how older homesteads often had barrels, tanks, or simple collection systems placed where roof water could be captured. Today, many people turn on a hose when the garden needs water without thinking about how much free water has already fallen around them. With a basic collection system and proper storage, rain can become part of the garden routine instead of being wasted. But collecting the water is only the first step, because the real old farming principle was to make that water work more than once. Rainwater was one of the first resources I learned to stop wasting, because once you start watching how much water falls from a roof during a normal storm, It becomes hard to understand why so much of it should simply disappear into the ground somewhere far from the garden. You do not need an expensive system to begin. A clean barrel or suitable storage tank connected to a roof downspout can collect a surprising amount of water, and that water can be useful during dry periods when the garden needs it most. I always recommend keeping collection containers covered and using proper screens and safe storage so mosquitoes, leaves, and other debris do not become a problem. The old principle was simple. If something falls freely onto your property, first ask whether it can be collected and used before you pay to replace it somewhere else. The same thinking applies to fertility. One of the most valuable materials on a small homestead can be something people are happy to throw away or treat as a nuisance. Well-managed animal manure can become useful fertilizer after it has been properly composted or aged, and it can help return nutrients to the soil instead of requiring you to buy another bag every season. Comfrey is another old garden plant that deserves a place in this conversation. It grows quickly, produces a lot of leaves, and can be used as material for compost or homemade plant feed when handled appropriately. I was shown years ago that a plant did not always need to be grown only for eating. Some plants could support the garden itself. That idea changed the way I looked at weeds, leaves, and unused corners of land. Instead of asking, "What can I buy for this problem?" I started asking, "What do I already have that can help solve it?" This is where the old system becomes interesting, because the goal was never to create one perfect product that solved everything. The goal was to connect several simple resources so that one supported another. Manure could help the soil produce better crops. Crops could provide food for the family and suitable material for animals. Animals could provide manure. Rainwater could support the crops. Plant leftovers could return to the compost. And then the harvest itself needed to be protected, because producing a large crop means very little if half of it spoils before you can eat it. That is why the next forgotten resource is not something you grow at all. It is the simple ability to store what you have already worked so hard to produce. One of the biggest changes I noticed over the years was how much food can be lost simply because people do not have a good way to store it. You can spend months preparing soil, planting seeds, watering plants, and protecting the harvest, then watch a large part of that food spoil within a few weeks. Older households had a different approach because they understood that growing food was only half the job. The other half was keeping it usable for as long as possible. A cool root cellar was one of the simplest tools for this. Potatoes, carrots, beets, onions, and other suitable crops could be stored in cool, dark, and reasonably humid conditions, depending on the crop, instead of filling the refrigerator or being left exposed in a warm kitchen. I remember visiting an old cellar where there was nothing fancy inside, just shelves, wooden crates, and carefully arranged vegetables, but the family could still be eating part of their garden long after the growing season had ended. The important lesson was that storage does not have to be complicated. You need the right temperature, reasonable airflow, protection from excess moisture, and regular checking, so one spoiled vegetable does not ruin several others. Fermentation was another method that helped families stretch their harvest much further. Cabbage, cucumbers, carrots, and other vegetables could be preserved through simple fermentation, giving people another way to keep food available after fresh crops were gone. Sauerkraut is probably the best-known example, but the larger principle matters more than any single recipe. When you preserve part of your harvest, you are not simply storing food. You are storing the work, water, seed, and effort that went into producing that food in the first place. I think many gardeners still make the mistake of measuring success only by how much they harvest in August or September. I prefer to ask how much of that harvest is still useful months later. That question changes the way you plant. You may choose more storage crops, more varieties that preserve well, and more vegetables that can be fermented or dried. You also begin looking at plants differently. Some crops can provide several kinds of value instead of only one. A grapevine can give fruit, shade, and material for preserving. A fruit tree can provide food for years. Comfrey can support the compost system. Bees can help pollination while producing honey and wax. This is the principle I keep coming back to. The best resource is often the one that performs several jobs, because that is how a small homestead can become more useful without becoming more expensive. And when all these resources begin working together, you reach the final idea that ties everything together, which is more important than any individual crop or animal. The most valuable resource on a homestead is not a seed packet, an animal, a rain barrel, or a piece of equipment. It is the homestead itself when all those things are connected and allowed to support each other. That is the part of old farming I understand better now than I did when I was young. A self-sufficient place was never about doing everything alone or refusing to buy anything. It was about reducing waste and making what you already have useful more than once. Your seeds can produce next year's crops. Your crops can feed your family and provide suitable material for animals. Animals can provide eggs, milk, or meat along with manure that can return to the soil. Rain can become water for the garden. Garden leftovers can become compost. Perennial plants can continue producing without being replanted every spring. A root cellar can protect the harvest, while fermentation can preserve vegetables that would otherwise be lost. Even a small number of useful plants and animals can become part of the system if you manage them carefully. I have seen people spend money trying to solve problems that could have been reduced simply by connecting two things they already had. A pile of leaves becomes a problem until you realize it can become compost. Vegetable scraps become rubbish until you have a sensible way to return them to the soil or use them appropriately. Rainwater looks useless until the garden becomes dry. A chicken looks like an expense until you consider the eggs, manure, and other benefits it can provide. This is why I think the old principle is still useful for people living on a small property, a large garden, or even a simple backyard. You do not need to recreate an old farm exactly as it was. You can take the principle and use it in a modern way that fits your time, land, and budget. Start with one resource that you are currently wasting and find one practical use for it. Then connect that result to another part of your garden. Over time, the system becomes stronger because you are not constantly starting from zero. You are building on what you already produced. And that is the real meaning of the 20th resource, the self-sufficient homestead itself. It is not one object you can buy from a store. It is a way of organizing what you have so that each useful thing helps create the next one. Once you start thinking this way, you may look at your garden, your animals, your water, and even your kitchen scraps very differently, because the next resource may already be sitting there waiting for you to notice it.